Welcome back. So we are in the midst of our Chapter 15 notes on the Federal Reserve System and monetary policy. This is part 3 of our Chapter 15 notes. We talked about the Fed's structure and how it looks. We talked about monetary policy, loose and tight. We've talked about the main tool of monetary policy, interest rates. That's where we left off last time. So I like to think of the Fed as holding a toolbox that it uses to sort of manipulate monetary policy. And inside that toolbox are 3 tools. The one it reaches for the most often, the one that gets the most press, is interest rates, but there are 2 others. And so today we're going to examine those other 2. And so first of all, we're going to look at fractional reserve banking. Fractional reserve banking is a term that means basically how much money does a bank have to keep. It's also called a reserve requirement. So all banks in the U.S. that are part of the Fed system have reserve requirements. If I go deposit my $100 paycheck after school today in the bank, what does the bank want to do with that money? So we've talked about this, right? How does the bank make money? It loans that money out. It's going to pay me interest on that $100, maybe 1%, but it's going to try to loan that money to someone else. Let's say Mr. Randall at, let's say, 6%, right? And so it'll make the 5% difference between those 2. That's its profit. Yeah. Anyway, so how much of that $100, if I go deposit it, can the bank loan out? Because let's say literally I go after school today and deposit $100 in a bank, and the bank turns around and takes literally that $100 and hands it to Randall and says, "Here, Randall, here's your $100 that you need to fix your car. Pay us back 5." They don't tell him, right? But Schusky's paying us 1. Woohoo! We make the difference. Anyway. Hey, Randall, you have 6 months to pay us back, or whatever. And then in 2 days, I walk down to my bank and go, oh, shoot, I had a flat tire. I need my $100 back, right? ATM, withdraw, whatever. Does that bank ever tell me, oh, sorry, Schusky, we don't have your money? Randall has it now? So almost never. Now, sometimes in sort of economic crises, that can happen. And that's how banks failed in the Great Depression, and there were runs on banks. People literally went into banks to, I want to withdraw my money, and they would say, no, I'm sorry, we don't have it. There's this famous scene in It's a Wonderful Life. It's a great Christmas movie, if you've never seen it, where Jimmy Stewart is talking people out of withdrawing all their money because the money's not there. It's in Mrs. Smith's roof, who borrowed the money from the bank to fix her roof and so on, right? But anyway, banks, the economic logic of profit in the bank is, of course, they want to loan out as much money as they can. They would love to loan out all 100 of my dollars, as long as I don't show up and demand it back. And banks tend to get in trouble left to their own devices. If they're making all of their own choices, banks will tend, historically, over time, to lend out more money than they really should. And they lend out that money, and they end up not being able to cover depositors, me coming back and wanting money, and then it leads to sort of crisis. So the government, through the Fed, stepped in over time and said, we're going to set reserve requirements ourselves. We're going to tell the bank that it has to keep a certain amount of money here. And that is also a very important tool in running monetary policy, in determining how much money exists in your economy. So just like with interest rates, if interest rates are low, people go to banks, borrow lots of money, and buy new cars, buy new houses. Hey, I'm pumping money into the economy that way, right? I've literally created new money because I've gotten more people to go to banks, borrow money, and then go to stores and spend it. Where did that money come from? The Fed created that, really, right? And at the same token, I can suck money out of the economy. I raise interest rates. People stop borrowing. Money sort of disappears. Anyway, the fractional reserve banking system is another way, another tool the Fed has to run this monetary policy stuff. Here's how. So if I go and deposit that $100 at the bank, and the Fed tells UMB, tells all banks, you guys have a reserve requirement of 40%, then UMB has to keep $40 out of my 100, 40% on reserve, has to keep $40 out of my 100 and keep it literally in the bank. Now it can go, and it might, deposit that at its bank, who's the banker's bank, yes, the Fed. But anyway, 40% of all of its deposits would have to be kept on hand. And so in my little example, right, I've deposited $100. It's got to keep 40. You know what it really wants to do with that remaining 60? Loan it out. So when Randall walks in, they'll say, hey, here's 60, please borrow. In fact, we'll knock 1/4% off interest or whatever. Anyway, that they want to lend that $60 so they can make money. So now all of a sudden you have $60 borrowed, right, and spent in the economy. Now, interestingly, let's say Randall takes that 60 and goes to the bike shop and buys a new bicycle for $60. What does the bike shop do with that 60? At the end of the day, it goes and deposits it in its bank. And what does its bank want to do with that $60? Loan out as much of it as it can. How much can it loan out? 40% of that. So it'll take 60% of 60, which I think is $36 if my high school math's all right, and it'll loan out $36. Think of that. That's from my original 100. Created that 60, which creates 36, which is lent out by now the bikes bank down the road here, right? Who then loans that to somebody who buys something, who deposits it in a bank, who. Anyway, there's this chain of sort of created money. Keep that in mind and look at pages 409 and 413 in your book as well. It does a good job of explaining the sort of crazy math, magic money creation of the fractional reserve banking system. But anyway, okay, so back to the sort of more basic sense of this, right? If my bank is told by the Fed in a reserve requirement, it's got to keep 40% on hand, so it can only loan out 60. Well, let's say the Fed tomorrow wakes up and goes, hey, we're going to change that reserve requirement to 20. Then I walk in and deposit my $100, right? And my bank now only has to keep 20 of that. It can loan out 80. And so I just went from $60 of economic activity to 80. Randall went from $60 to $80. He just bought a much more expensive bike, right? For a bag plus a basket and a helmet, or whatever. And now that bike shop made $80 and it deposits 80 in its bank and it has even more to loan out and more to loan out. And the opposite, of course, is true. If the reserve requirement goes from 40% to 70%, well, now my bank has to keep $70 on hand. It can only loan out 30. Randall can't even afford a bike. He's got to buy a little scooter. I don't know, whatever. And economic activity is slower. There's far less money in your economy. So, of course, if loose monetary policy is more money in your economy, that means lower reserve requirements. So in addition to lower interest rates, lower reserve requirements are a way that the Fed can encourage economic activity, pump money into an economy. And conversely, if it raises reserve requirements, banks have to keep a lot more of that money. They can't lend as much out. It's a way of sucking money out of the economy, slowing the economy down. That's called tight monetary policy. It's just like raising interest rates. Yeah. So that's the fractional reserve banking side. And then lastly, our third tool, there are only 3 tools of monetary policy really that the Fed has. And our third tool is called open market operations. Open market operations. And in open market operations, the Fed is simply buying or selling treasury bills, treasury bonds, basically government IOUs are really government debt. So the government borrows money all the time. It spends more than it earns. Governments, of course, earn money through taxation, and the government has to borrow additional money to cover its expenses. And it borrows that money from us, from Americans, and from corporations, and from other countries. People think China owns all of America's debt. The government of China does own a large part of America's total $21 trillion debt. But by far the biggest chunk of American debt is that government debt is held by Americans. If you have a treasury bill, a treasury note, a savings bond, right? Did grandma buy you a $100 savings bond or $25 savings bond for your 6th Christmas and you thought it really sucked because it wasn't a toy? Anyway, literally that's just government debt. Yeah, that's a little piece of paper that represents the government will pay you back more money in the future. And so literally your grandma had to go to the bank and pay the bank $12.50 to buy that $25 savings bond. The bank basically passed on $12.48 of that or whatever to the federal government who needed it to go pay bills for aircraft carriers or whatever it's borrowing money to pay for. The bank took 2 cents for dealing with it. And the government then will pay your grandmother back or you back, because you know how that savings bond, $25, woo, in 19 years or whatever the maturity date is on that savings bond. But anyway, the government will pay back double, right? You buy it for $12.50 and you sell it 19 years later for $25. Literally that $25 is just in the middle, is just debt, yeah, or interest. But anyway, so the Fed goes and buys and sells these treasury bills, treasury notes, savings bonds, treasury bills and treasury T-bills and T-notes, or treasury bills, treasury notes are really savings bonds in the hundreds of thousands and millions of dollar range that corporations and governments are often buying, pension funds, you name it. But they all operate the same way. Anyway, there's a bond market, just like there is a stock market. There's a place where people come together to buy and sell bonds. And government bonds are one of the big parts of the bond market. Private corporations are also buying and selling bonds all the time. If Coca-Cola needs a bunch of money, it might issue a bunch of bonds and raise a bunch of money up front and use that money to build a new factory and then pay those bonds back over time. Collinsville Unit 10 School District issued bonds to build the auditorium and cafeteria some years ago. It needed a bunch of money up front, and then it paid back that money a little bit every year over time through taxes, right? And so that's all a bond is. Anyway, so there's a bond market. People buy and sell these bonds. And if the Fed is buying government debt, so literally like the Fed goes to the bond market and starts buying debt, buying US government T-bills or savings bonds. Yeah, think about that. The Fed is taking cash, and the Fed can literally print cash. So the Fed wants to do this. It runs the printing presses overnight, takes a wad of cash, goes to the bond market and says, we're going to buy US government debt. And it is literally just like dumping money into the economy, buying things, right? When we buy something, we're giving money to the store, in this case, the bond market. So the Fed is creating money, going to the bond markets, putting that money in the economy, right? And then taking government debt out of the bond market. And the Fed, becomes the owner of US government debt. So that is loose monetary policy. By buying government debt on the open market, it is running loose monetary policy, pumping money in the economy, and then it can just do the exact opposite, right? The Fed has in its portfolio all of these bonds, T-bills, T-notes. The Fed has lots of government debt. If it takes that debt to the bond market and sells it, hey, bond market, take this. We'll sell it for cheaper today than yesterday. We'll create demand for it by lowering price, whatever it is, right? But if the Fed is selling debt on the bond market, well, if you have an item and you sell it in the marketplace, you take that cash and you get it, right? And so if you're the Fed and you are taking cash out of the economy, out of the bond market, you are literally taking money out of the economy, shred it, throw it away. I just decreased the money supply, right? Is a very effective way for the Fed to very quickly take money out of the economy and tighten monetary policy by selling the debt it owns on the bond market. And then the opposite of that is true. It can go create money, buy debt on the open market, pump money into the economy. So a very, very quick way to also run tight or loose monetary policy is called open market operations. So we'll conclude our Chapter 15, Part 3 notes there. Thanks for your attention. Of course, holler if you have any questions.